Before we get into this video, I just want to take a moment to welcome you back to another exciting episode. Did God exist before Abraham? This might seem like a simple question, but the answer unlocks hidden dimensions of the divine narrative, revealing a timeless presence that predates the familiar biblical stories. Imagine a tapestry of God's presence woven throughout history, threads connecting the divine to humanity long before Abraham. This video reveals those hidden threads, unraveling a deeper understanding of Yahweh's enduring power and influence. The Bible begins with Abraham, but God's story begins long before. Join us as we uncover the forgotten chapters of Yahweh's presence, exploring a hidden narrative that transcends the familiar stories. Now, in today's video, we are going to be looking at the very important topic of Yahweh before Abraham. Now, as many of you know, the book of Genesis opens up with the creation of the world. But it is primarily focused on the stories of Abraham and his descendants. Yet there's something that many people don't realize. There are certain things that happened before Abraham that we really don't hear about until we go to the book of Exodus. And so today, we're going to look at some of those hidden threads that connect Yahweh before Abraham to the time when Moses came on the scene. Before we dive into this, please make sure that you click the like button below and subscribe if you haven't already so that you can be notified whenever I post new videos. Let's get into the Word. In the opening chapters of Genesis, we see the world come into existence through the power of God's creative words. Humans are created in God's image and placed in the Garden of Eden to live in harmony with God and all creation. However, sin disrupts this harmony and humanity falls away from God, bringing judgment and death into the world. In this context, God makes an interesting statement in Genesis 6, verse 3 that is often overlooked. It reads, "The Lord said, My spirit will not contend with humankind forever, for he is mortal. His days shall be 120 years. This statement reveals a crucial aspect of God's character that is frequently underestimated: his self-limitation. This idea is further emphasized in chapter 8, verse 21, where it says, The Lord smelled the sweet aroma and said in himself, See that I have established my covenant day and night with the day, and night order, the fixed order of heaven and earth. These passages demonstrate that while God is eternal and capable of doing anything, he intentionally places boundaries on his actions. He doesn't forcibly impose his will on humans. Rather, he gives them a choice to respond to him. This principle extends beyond these specific instances and permeates all of God's dealings with humanity. In the account of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, we see people attempting to build a tower that reaches to the heavens. Their goal is to make a name for themselves and prevent their dispersion across the earth. God thwarts their plans by introducing confusion and diversity of languages. This event marks a significant turning point, scattering people across the earth and hindering the realization of their ambitious plans. Despite this setback, the Bible tells us that people continue to multiply and spread across the earth. Humanity's resilience and determination to build and create persist, evident in various human endeavors throughout history. However, amidst this backdrop, the Bible reveals that God continues to work behind the scenes. preparing the way for a special individual named Abraham. In a surprising turn of events, we meet Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, called Abram at the time, who is summoned by God to leave his homeland and go to Canaan. This call initiates a new phase in God's plan, marking the beginning of a special relationship between God and Abraham and his descendants. Many Christians stop their study of God's interaction with mankind right here with Abraham. However, there are multiple scriptures that tell us that God was active on the earth long before Abraham's time. In Genesis 5:24, it tells us that Enoch, who was the father of Methuselah, walked with God, and then he simply vanished because God took him. So we can see that God was active during the time of Enoch. Then, of course, when we read Genesis 7, we see God interacting with Noah during the time of the flood. In Genesis 7:3, it tells us that God said to Noah, "You and your sons with you, wife and your sons' wives with you, enter the ark. For me, I am bringing the floodwaters on the earth to destroy all flesh, all creatures, and everything that moves along with it. Everything that is on the earth will die." So we can see that God interacted with Noah long before Abraham ever came on the scene. Another thing that we must remember is that God created the world long before Abraham was even a thought. So he definitely had a presence on the earth before Abraham. But I think many Christians fail to realize that God didn't just have a presence on the earth. During the creation week or during the time of Adam and Eve, Noah and Enoch, the truth is that God has always had a presence on the earth and always will. Psalm chapter 139 verses 7-8 says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there also." These words from King David reveal a profound truth about God's omnipresence. He is not limited by physical boundaries or locations. Instead, God's presence is everywhere, transcending space and time. This means that no matter where someone may try to hide or escape, they cannot evade God's presence. God's knowledge encompasses all things. He is aware of every action and thought, leaving no room for secrets or privacy. In other words, there is nowhere that a person can go where God's presence and knowledge do not extend. In light of this reality, the idea that God's influence began with Abraham becomes questionable. When we consider God's eternal and all-encompassing nature, His presence and influence have always existed and continue to exist in every place. Therefore, it would be inaccurate to suggest that God's actions started with Abraham. Instead, we should recognize that God has always been involved in the affairs of humanity and the world. Abraham's story marks a significant point in history, but it is not the starting point of God's activity. If God's influence truly began with Abraham, it implies that before Abraham, God wasn't actively involved in the lives of humans on earth. However, this contradicts numerous biblical accounts. As we've seen, the scriptures provide clear evidence of God's presence and interactions with individuals such as Enoch, Noah, and even the people in the time of the Tower of Babel. Moreover, the notion that God's influence began with Abraham challenges the concept of divine providence. If God only became active with Abraham, It raises questions about how previous generations lived without God's guidance or intervention. It also contradicts the belief that God is sovereign over all things, suggesting that events prior to Abraham occurred independently of divine influence. This perspective fails to acknowledge the broader biblical narrative and the consistent portrayal of God's involvement in human affairs throughout history. So let's recap what we've learned. The Bible teaches us that God is eternal and has always existed. He has a presence in every place and at all times. He has never ceased to be involved in the affairs of humanity and the world. It would be incorrect to suggest that God's actions started with Abraham, as this contradicts numerous biblical accounts and teachings. This is actually a very special episode because it's a bit of a return to form. If you're familiar with my earlier work, you'll know that I used to do a lot more episodes on the ancient world. And while I'm still not sure how much time I'm gonna have to dedicate to producing these videos, I figured I would give it another go. So let me know in the comments what you think of this format. How do you like this style of video? Would you like to see more of it? Let me know. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about the ancient world, specifically the ancient Near East, and how some of the traditions from that world may have informed or influenced the development of Abrahamic religion. So without further ado, let's get into it. The story of creation in the book of Genesis has always been a source of fascination for me. Mostly because when you start looking into the topic of creation in other ancient cultures, you find so many parallels. In fact, I've talked about this before in an older video. But when you look at the myths and creation stories of the ancient Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, and even some of the Greeks, you find some striking similarities. Now, there are differences, of course, but there are definitely some similarities. And that leads to two questions. First, why are there so many parallels between these different cultures? And second, did any one culture influence the others? Or to put it another way, was the Genesis account simply a retelling of a more common Near Eastern myth? Or did the author of Genesis have that kind of story in mind when he wrote his account? Now, scholars have come to different conclusions regarding these questions. But I'm not going to talk about that today. What I want to do instead is focus on one particular aspect of this question. Instead of looking at the creation accounts from other cultures, I want to focus on the earliest layer of the Hebrew Bible, the written Torah, and see what kind of influence those earlier traditions had on the Genesis account. If you're unfamiliar with the subject, let me quickly summarize. When scholars refer to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, they generally recognize that the text was not written all at once. In fact, there are clear differences in the writing style and literary techniques between different sections. For this reason, scholars divide the Torah into different sources, which they designate by different letters. One of the most widely accepted models posits that the Torah was composed of 4 main sources, which scholars designate J, E, P, and Deuteronomy. Now, this is obviously a complicated subject, and I'm just scratching the surface. I'm simplifying things to make it easier to explain. But basically, J, E, and P are hypothetical sources that were later redacted and compiled into what we have now in the Torah. Each source has its own distinctive style and theological perspective, and scholars believe that each was transmitted orally for generations before being written down. J, for example, refers to God as Yahweh. E refers to God as Elohim, and P seems to refer to God as both Elohim and Yahweh. And Deuteronomy is basically just that, the book of Deuteronomy, which traditionally is attributed to Moses. And here's where our subject becomes interesting. Scholars believe that the Elohim tradition goes back to pre-Abrahamic Israel. In other words, it predates the Yahwist source, and if that's true, then it potentially goes back to the Canaanite period, maybe even before. And according to scholars, the Elohim tradition has a different understanding of God than the later Yahwist tradition. Yahweh is personal and particular. He chose Israel, and he wants an intimate relationship with them. Elohim, on the other hand, is more distant. He's less interested in the relationship with Israel and more interested in maintaining order in the cosmos. Elohim doesn't really care about having a relationship with his creation. That's something that develops later with Yahweh. So now let's take a look at the relevant passage in Exodus 20. Let's start with verse 2. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Okay, so here we have the Shema, the foundational confession of the Hebrew Bible. And it tells us right away that Yahweh is the God of Israel. It also tells us that he delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt. And that's important because it gives us clues about the nature of Yahweh. He's a God who acts. He's not just some far-off, detached deity. He's involved in the affairs of men. He's interested in saving his people from oppression. But notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say anything about creation. That's important because what it doesn't say is just as important as what it does say. Yahweh isn't mentioned in this creation account, but he is clearly God. This is significant because it suggests that the creation account isn't simply a retelling of a Mesopotamian myth. There's no mention of the primeval sea, Tiamat. There's no mention of the creation of man from clay. And there's no mention of the creation of woman from man. All those motifs are found in the ancient Near East, but they're not present here. Instead, we have a God who made the heavens and the earth, a God who created all that we see around us. And that's important because it helps us understand what Elohim represents. Elohim is a Canaanite word that means gods. It's plural, and it originally referred to a pantheon of gods, a group of deities who lived on Mount Canaan and controlled the forces of nature. As you can probably imagine, that was a bit problematic for the Yahwists, who believed in one God. So they took the word Elohim and used it to refer to the God of Israel. To make that transition easier, they changed the pronunciation of the word slightly and began adding the definite article, which is a bit hard to explain. But basically they began calling him the gods. They didn't necessarily mean it in a plural sense, but it was a way of referring to the God of Israel without using the name Yahweh. And that's important because it suggests that the Elohim tradition never abandoned the belief in a pantheon of gods. In fact, it seems to have done just the opposite. It took the plural word Elohim and used it to refer to the God of Israel. We see this in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form, void and dark, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the deep. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Then God saw that it was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and morning, the first day. Thus the heavens and the earth were created. And when God finished creating them, he was pleased with them. And God said, "It is good." Okay, so what do you notice here? Notice how the author refers to God throughout the chapter. He uses the plural form, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." So it seems that the Elohim tradition wasn't comfortable with the idea of one God creating everything. In fact, it seems that he needed help. And that's important because it helps us understand how the Genesis account fits into the broader context of the ancient Near East. It wasn't simply a retelling of a Mesopotamian myth. It was a deliberate attempt to present the God of Israel as the creator of the world. And in order to do that, he needed some help. And that's where the ancient Near Eastern myths come in. The author of Genesis knew those myths well. He knew the story of Apsu and Tiamat, the story of the creation of man from clay, and the story of the creation of woman from man. And he intentionally wove those stories into his own account. And that's why Genesis is such a fascinating book. It's not simply a retelling of a Mesopotamian myth. It's a reinterpretation of those myths from a distinctly Israelite perspective. The author of Genesis was familiar with the ancient Near Eastern myths, but he didn't simply accept them. He took those myths and reshaped them, reinterpreting them in light of his own theological perspective. And that's why it's so important to study the ancient Near East. It helps us understand how the author of Genesis interpreted those myths. It helps us understand how he wove those stories into his own account. And it helps us appreciate the genius of Genesis as a piece of literature. The author of Genesis was a master storyteller. He knew how to capture his audience's attention. He knew how to build suspense. And he knew how to deliver a powerful message. And he accomplished all that by using the stories that his audience was already familiar with. That's why Genesis is such a powerful book. It's a book that speaks to us on multiple levels. It's a book that can be read on a purely literal level. But it's also a book that can be appreciated on a literary level. It's a book that speaks to us about the nature of God. It speaks to us about the nature of humanity. And it speaks to us about the relationship between God and humanity. And all that makes Genesis one of the most fascinating books in the Bible. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I thought it would be fun to revisit the ancient world and explore some of the topics that I used to cover on this channel. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you enjoy this style of video? Would you like to see more of it? Also, if there's a particular topic you'd like to see covered on this channel, let me know. I'm always open to suggestions. Now you might be thinking, what exactly does that mean? And honestly, it's a question I've grappled with too. At its core, this idea has revolutionized how I view our relationship with God, and it can do the same for you. So let's break it down together. Picture a tapestry. You look at it from afar and see a beautiful design, vibrant colors, intricate patterns. But then you step closer to examine it more closely and realize it's made up of countless individual threads. Some are bold, some are subtle, but each contributes to the overall masterpiece. Our understanding of God's interaction with humanity is much like that tapestry, and there's a particular thread I want to highlight today, one that, when pulled, unravels a deeper, richer understanding of our faith. This thread takes us back to the very essence of who God is. You see, if we solely rely on the patriarchal narrative, we get a limited perspective, almost like looking through a keyhole. The story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob becomes the main lens through which we view our relationship with God. And while these stories are foundational, they only tell part of the story. The patriarchal thread, when examined in isolation, can inadvertently paint a picture of God that's not entirely accurate. It's as though we're focusing on a single color in the tapestry, missing the full spectrum that makes up the grand design. To truly appreciate this tapestry, to grasp the full measure of God's character and our relationship with Him, we must uncover the hidden threads. We need to recognize that the Abrahamic narrative, while significant, is not the only thread in this vast tapestry. There are other traditions, beliefs, and experiences woven into the fabric that are just as vital in understanding the full scope of our faith. This realization is what I refer to as uncovering hidden threads. It's about acknowledging that the story of God's interaction with humanity is much broader, deeper, and richer than what can be contained within the patriarchal narrative alone. Think of it like this. If all you knew about art was what you saw inside a cave, you might be impressed by the paintings, but you'd be oblivious to the world of Renaissance masterpieces, abstract art, and modern installations. Your understanding of art would be incomplete. Similarly, if our understanding of God is solely shaped by the patriarchal narrative, we miss out on the vast richness that other threads bring to the tapestry. We limit our view of God to the lens of a single tradition, blinding us to the broader, more inclusive picture He wants us to see. Now, you might be wondering why this matters. Why should we go to the trouble of uncovering these hidden threads? And the answer is simple: transformative. When we start viewing God through the lens of a single tradition, it can inadvertently create a distorted image. It's as if we were to remove several threads from the tapestry, leaving gaping holes in our understanding of His character. For example, if we solely rely on the patriarchal narrative, we might get the impression that God's primary means of communication with humanity is through direct, personal revelation. While this certainly occurs in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's not the only way God chooses to reveal Himself. He also speaks through creation, through the conscience, and later through the prophets and the written word. Limiting our understanding of God's communication methods based on the patriarchal narrative alone leaves us vulnerable to misinterpreting His will and purpose for our lives. Uncovering the hidden threads allows us to see God in a more comprehensive, accurate light. It enables us to experience a richer, more profound relationship with Him. Imagine going back to that tapestry. If you only focused on one thread, you wouldn't see the beauty of the intricate patterns, the blend of various colors, or the masterful weaving techniques. But when you step back and take in the entire piece, your appreciation grows. Similarly, when we incorporate various threads of divine revelation into our understanding of God, our appreciation and understanding of Him deepens. we begin to see him not just as a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but as the creator of the universe, the sustainer of life, the hearer of prayer, the revealer of truth through both word and deed. Think of the lives of those who lived before Abraham. Were they devoid of God's presence? Did they lack access to his love and grace? The answer is an absolute no. The patriarchal narrative doesn't begin the story of God's interaction with humanity. It's merely one significant chapter within a much larger book. Uncovering this hidden thread broadens our perspective, allowing us to acknowledge and respect the spiritual journeys of all people. Throughout history, it challenges us to move beyond the limitations of a single narrative and embrace a more inclusive, God-honoring perspective. It's like realizing that your family's history isn't confined to the stories your grandparents told you. It extends back through countless generations, encompassing countless more stories that have shaped who you are today. In the same way, our understanding of God's interaction with humanity deepens when we uncover these hidden threads. We begin to see ourselves as part of a vast, rich tapestry, connected to countless individuals and stories that have walked with God, each contributing to the grand narrative of faith. So here's a call to action. Let's embark on a journey of discovery together. Let's delve into the various narratives, beliefs, and experiences that make up the tapestry of our faith. Let's uncover the hidden threads that connect us to a broader, more comprehensive understanding of God. The Bible itself encourages us to seek wisdom, and wisdom, my friends, is often found in the richness of diverse perspectives. When we come together and share our insights, we collectively weave a more intricate, vibrant thread into the tapestry of our faith. Our understanding of God deepens, our relationship with Him becomes more profound, and we're better equipped to share the fullness of our faith with those around us. The journey of faith is not meant to be walked alone. It's a path best traveled together, sharing stories, insights, and perspectives that enrich our understanding of God and His ways. Remember, you don't have to walk this journey alone. Reach out to fellow travelers, engage in thoughtful discussions, and together explore the hidden threads that make up the rich, beautiful tapestry of our faith. Don't shy away from asking questions. Embrace the unknown as an opportunity for growth and learning. Your understanding of God might be the missing piece someone else needs to complete their own tapestry. In closing, I want to leave you with this. Uncovering hidden threads is not about abandoning the core teachings of your faith. It's about enriching them, deepening them, and broadening our perspective. It's about acknowledging that the story of God's interaction with humanity is a vast, intricate narrative that's still being written. Each of us has a part to play in adding our unique thread to this tapestry. So let's continue the conversation. What hidden threads have you discovered in your walk with God? How has it changed or deepened your understanding of Him? Share your insights below, and let's continue to weave a richer, more vibrant tapestry of faith together. As I mentioned last week, we've been going through a series that focuses on stories from the Hebrew Bible that predate Abraham. Now, most Christians don't spend much time thinking about what happened before Abraham because they think those stories are only relevant to Jews or Muslims. But these stories were actually written by Jews and were considered sacred scripture long before Christianity existed. and they contain some profound lessons for all of us who believe in Yahweh. Whether you're a Christian, Muslim, Jew, or any other faith tradition, some might argue that studying this ancient history is useless because it doesn't directly teach us anything about Jesus. But let me ask you this. Did Jesus not know these stories? Did he not grow up hearing them in the synagogue? Did he not have Moses as his hero? Did he not know the stories of the Exodus, the conquest, Joshua, or the Judges? Of course he did. And if these stories were important enough for Jesus and his disciples, then I think they should also be important to us, and not just scholars, but every believer. And now, more than ever, people are looking for answers to life's big questions, and we can't give them a one-word answer of faith. That isn't enough. They want to know why they should believe. They want to know who God really is. So allow me to introduce you to a good friend of mine, Dr. Tim Mackey, who holds a PhD in biblical studies. He is the founder and lead instructor of the Biblical Horizons project at biblicalhorizons.com, which offers an extensive online library of classes covering a variety of subjects related to the origins of our faith. And now let's get into the meat of the message: Yahweh's timeless power and presence. As followers of Yah, we often picture him as a God of the past, a God who was active in the days of the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but not really in our day. However, when we examine these texts more closely, we discover that Yahweh was not just a God of the distant past. He was, is, and always will be a living and active God, transcending time and space. Let's start with the first point. Yahweh is a God who acts in history. Many Christians limit God's presence to the pages of Scripture, believing he was active in the past, but not really now. But Genesis 2:2 foretells us that God created the earth and everything in it. And Colossians 1:16 says that all things were created through him and for him. This means that God is actively involved in the world, not just then, but now too. We serve a God who is not confined to the pages of a book or a building. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, yes, but also the God of today. Now you might say, well, of course, he's still God, but he's not involved in human affairs anymore. To that I would say, have you read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation? God is consistently portrayed as a God who cares about his creation. He sent prophets to guide his people. He parted the Red Sea to deliver Israel from slavery. He provided manna and water in the wilderness. And he raised Jesus from the dead. Nothing is too hard for him. No mountain is too high for him to move. He is still on the throne, and he still cares about his creation. But what about those times when it seems like God is silent or absent? In those moments, remember that God is never absent. He is always present, even when we don't feel his presence. Psalm 139 tells us that God is everywhere, knowing our thoughts and understanding our frame. Even when we try to escape his presence, it is impossible because God is spirit. He is everywhere, transcending time and space. You see, many Christians struggle with the idea of God being both all-knowing and sovereign, yet still allowing evil and suffering in the world. But here's the thing. God is not surprised by anything that happens. He knows everything that will happen before it happens. But He also gives us free will. And free will means that there will be times when we make choices that go against God's will. But this doesn't mean that God is powerless. It simply means that He allows us to have our own will so that we can choose Him freely. If God forced us to follow Him, then our faith would be worthless. But thankfully, God gives us the choice. And when we choose Him, He promises to never leave us or forsake us. So the first lesson we learn from these stories is that Yahweh is a God who acts in history. He is not just a God of the past, but also the God of today. He is still on the throne, and He still cares about His creation. Our second lesson is that Yahweh has a heart for all people. Many Christians limit God's love to just those who believe in Jesus. But these stories show us that God's love extends far beyond that. God created all people, and He wants them to know Him and follow Him. Let's look at Genesis 12:3. I will bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give you and your offspring every blessing. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Genesis 18:18 says that Abraham will become a great nation, but he won't stand alone. Other nations will also come out of him. This shows us that God's love and salvation aren't limited to Abraham or his descendants. He desires that all people from every nation turn to Him. So why does God care about other religions or people who don't know Him? Well, simply because He loves them. He wants them to come to know Him and experience the abundant life that He offers. And it's not just a feeling, it's a commitment. God is committed to seeking and saving the lost. It's not an option for Him. It's who He is. You see, God doesn't force Himself on people, but He desires to be known and worshipped by all. Let me give you an example. When Jesus taught the Great Commission in Matthew 28:19-20, He told His disciples to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything He had commanded them. Notice that He didn't say just Jews or Christians. He said all nations. Why? Because God's love and salvation aren't limited to one group of people. They extend to everyone. The fact that God made covenants with Abraham and Moses doesn't change the fact that He still desires to reach all people. Those covenants were specific agreements between God and Israel, but they don't limit God's love and salvation to just Jews. In fact, the New Testament clearly teaches that God's promises extend to all who believe, regardless of their background. Galatians 3:28 says that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So the second lesson we learn from these stories is that Yahweh has a heart for all people, His. Love and salvation aren't limited to one group, but extend to everyone. If you enjoyed this message, I invite you to check out my class called Pre-Abraham, Origins of the Ancient Faith, where I dive deeper into the world before Abraham. In this class, you'll explore the stories and teachings found in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and discover how they shaped the foundation of our faith. You'll gain insights into the historical and cultural context of these ancient texts and learn how they continue to be relevant in today's world. All right, thank you so much for joining me today, and until next time, remember God's timeless power and presence in your life. May these stories inspire you and remind you that Yahweh is not just a God of the past, but also the living God of today. Stay curious, keep exploring, and may your faith continue to grow.